I thought signing those divorce papers would finally end my nightmare. Instead, it was the beginning of a question I still couldn't answer. The judge had barely left the courtroom when my former mother-in-law hurried across the hallway and grabbed my wrist. Her face had turned so pale I thought she might collapse. "She didn't tell you?" she whispered. "Tell me what?" I asked. She looked past me at my ex-husband. His shoulders stiffened. My younger sister lowered her eyes. No one spoke another word. Then my former mother-in-law released my hand, climbed into her old pickup truck, and drove away, leaving me standing on the courthouse steps in Eastern Tennessee with a question that somehow felt heavier than the divorce I had just finalized. 6 months earlier, my life had been as ordinary as anyone could hope for. Daniel and I had spent 26 years building a quiet marriage in the same white farmhouse outside town. Every Sunday we attended church together before stopping at our favorite diner for biscuits, eggs, and coffee. We talked about retirement, planting tomatoes in the spring, and the grandchildren we hoped would someday fill our home with laughter. I truly believed we had already survived the hardest years of our lives. Then my younger sister, Linda, called one rainy afternoon. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Her divorce had emptied her savings, and she had nowhere to go. Without a second thought, I invited her to stay in our guest room for as long as she needed. Family helps family. That's the way I was raised. And I never imagined that kindness could become the very thing that would break my heart. During the first few weeks, Linda seemed grateful for everything. She cooked supper with me, folded laundry, attended church beside us, and thanked me almost every day. Then little things began catching my attention. Daniel suddenly insisted on driving her into town whenever she needed groceries. Their conversation stopped the moment I walked into the room. More than once, I woke after midnight and noticed both of their cars missing from the driveway. When I asked where they had been, Daniel always had a calm explanation ready. I wanted to believe him, but something just didn't sit right. Folks notice more than people think. So I stopped asking questions and started paying attention. A week later, Linda asked us to sit down because she had something important to tell us. She rested both hands on her stomach, looked directly at Daniel instead of me, and quietly said, "I'm pregnant. And they're twins." The room fell into a silence so heavy, I knew my life was about to change forever. The silence seemed to swallow the room. I looked from Linda to Daniel, waiting for one of them to laugh and tell me it was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, Daniel lowered his head, and Linda reached across the table until their hands touched. She didn't even look at me when she whispered, "The babies are his." For a moment, I couldn't hear anything except the ticking of the old clock hanging above the fireplace. 26 years of marriage, countless holidays, family dinners, and quiet evenings on our front porch all seemed to disappear in a single sentence. I didn't scream. I didn't throw dishes or demand explanations. I simply stood, walked into our bedroom, and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at our wedding photograph, remembering the promises we had made, before our families, and before God. It wasn't only my husband who had betrayed me. My own sister had been sitting across from me at church every Sunday, sharing meals at my table, smiling as though nothing had changed. The next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee, listened to the old coffee maker humming in the kitchen, and called a family law attorney. After hearing my story, he gave me advice that shaped every decision I made afterward. "Don't waste your energy arguing," he said. "Truth has a way of speaking for itself if you give it the chance." I followed his advice. While Daniel packed his belongings and moved into a rental house with Linda, I quietly gathered every financial document I could find. I copied bank statements, tax returns, retirement records, insurance papers, and credit card statements before placing each one back exactly where it belonged. Daniel never suspected a thing. Around town, people whispered whenever I walked into the grocery store or church fellowship hall. Some offered kind smiles. Others looked away, unsure what to say. I appreciated the silence more than empty sympathy. Then one afternoon, my attorney called and asked me to come to his office immediately. He spread several bank statements across his desk and pointed to a series of withdrawals I had never noticed before. Thousands of dollars had been transferred out of our savings over the past 4 years. The dates stopped me cold. According to Daniel, the affair had started less than a year ago. So why had our retirement money been disappearing years before? Linda ever claimed to be carrying his twins? That was the question neither of them could answer. I couldn't stop staring at the bank statements spread across my attorney's desk. Every highlighted withdrawal felt like Another piece of my life quietly disappearing before I had even realized something was wrong. We had spent years setting money aside for retirement, skipping vacations, driving older cars, and living within our means because we believed those sacrifices would give us peace later in life. Now nearly $80,000 was gone. My attorney traced his finger down the pages and stopped at the account number, receiving every transfer. It belonged to Linda. This wasn't a mistake, he said. It was a pattern. I drove home with one question echoing through my mind. If the affair had only started recently, why had Daniel been sending my sister money for nearly 4 years? A week later, Daniel appeared for his deposition. He looked exhausted, as though months of sleepless nights had finally caught up with him. Under oath, he admitted making every transfer. Then he told us why. Linda had convinced him she needed expensive fertility treatments after her divorce. She said she was too embarrassed to tell me because she feared I would pity her. She begged him to keep everything secret until she could repay the money. Daniel said he believed he was helping family through a private struggle. I wanted to be angry, but I could also see something else on his face. Shame. Before I had time to think about his testimony, my phone rang. It was my former mother-in-law asking if I would meet her at a small diner just outside town. When I arrived, she was already waiting with a worn manila envelope resting beside her coffee cup. Her hands trembled as she pushed it toward me. "I thought Linda had already told you," she said softly. Inside were canceled checks, handwritten notes, and copies of medical invoices. Then she handed me a letter from the fertility clinic. It stated clearly that Linda had never been a patient there and that every invoice bearing the clinic's name was fraudulent. My former mother-in-law lowered her head and quietly admitted she had confronted Linda 3 years earlier. Linda confessed the money had never been for medical care. She had used it to pay gambling debts and begged her not to tell anyone, promising she would make everything right. I had spent months believing the affair destroyed my family. Sitting there in that little diner, I realized the affair wasn't the beginning. It was only the final lie in a deception that had started years before. Leaving the diner, I felt strangely calm. The truth no longer lived in guesses or whispered conversations. It was written in bank records, canceled checks, and a letter from a medical clinic. My attorney often said that evidence doesn't raise its voice because it never has to. For the first time since my world fell apart, I understood exactly what he meant. A few days later, we met again at the county courthouse for another round of depositions. The courthouse was quiet, except for the echo of footsteps in the hallway and the steady hum of an old air conditioner. Linda walked into the room with her head held high, but her confidence faded as the evidence was placed one document at a time before her. My attorney asked simple questions. Did she receive fertility treatment? No record supported her claim. Did she create the invoices? A handwriting expert matched every forged document to samples she had signed at the bank. Did I ever approve the transfers from our retirement account? Every bank employee testified that only Daniel had authorized them. One excuse after another quietly collapsed beneath the weight of the facts. When it was Daniel's turn to testify, he admitted he had believed Linda from the beginning. He said she told him she was desperate, ashamed, and terrified that I would judge her if I learned she couldn't have children. He confessed he had convinced himself he was protecting both sisters by keeping her secret. Looking at him, I realized something important. He had been deceived, but he had also chosen to deceive me. No amount of regret could erase that decision. Several weeks later, the judge issued the final ruling because the court found that substantial marital funds had been transferred. Without my knowledge or consent, the property division was adjusted in my favor. I kept the farmhouse, my retirement savings were protected, and Daniel accepted the court's decision without argument. Around our small community, people slowly learned what had really happened. No one celebrated Linda's downfall. Folks simply stopped believing her stories. Invitations grew fewer, phone calls stopped coming, and even those who had once questioned my character quietly apologized. As I walked out of the courthouse, breathing the warm Tennessee air for what felt like the first time in months, I believed the worst was finally behind me. Then my former mother-in-law hurried toward me carrying one last envelope. Tears filled her eyes as she pressed it into my hands. "Read this when you get home," she whispered. "It's the reason I asked if she'd told you." I opened the envelope that evening, and the very first sentence changed everything I thought I knew. I sat alone at my kitchen table long after sunset, listening to the crickets outside and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. The envelope remained unopened beside my coffee cup for several minutes. When I finally unfolded the pages inside, I recognized Linda's handwriting immediately. It wasn't a letter addressed to me. It was a confession she had written years earlier, after my former mother-in-law confronted her about the forged medical bills. She admitted inventing the fertility treatments, creating fake invoices, and using Daniel's sympathy to gain access to our savings. Then I reached the line that took my breath away. I wanted her life because I never believed I could build one of my own. I read it again, slower this time. For months I had searched for something I had done wrong. I wondered if I had failed as a wife, as a sister, or as a woman. Those few words answered every question. This tragedy hadn't started because my marriage was unhappy. It had started because envy had quietly replaced honesty. The following week, my former mother-in-law came to see me. She apologized for remaining silent all those years, admitting she believed Linda would eventually confess and make things right. I told her we had both trusted someone we loved, and sometimes trust makes good people hesitate when they should speak. We cried together before parting as friends instead of former relatives. Daniel wrote twice asking if we could meet and talk. I answered with one short letter. I wished him peace, but I also told him there would be no second chance. Forgiveness allows a heart to heal. It doesn't erase consequences. As the months passed, my life became wonderfully ordinary again. I returned to church every Sunday, shared coffee with neighbors after the service, tended my little garden, and spent quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the hills. Peace returned one small day at a time. People still ask how I survived losing both my husband and my sister. I always give the same answer. I survived because I stopped chasing explanations and started trusting the truth. Lies may travel fast, but evidence always arrives eventually. Looking back now, I don't remember the betrayal as clearly as I remember the day. I finally found peace. After everything that happened, I learned one lesson worth carrying for the rest of my life. Family isn't defined by the people who share your blood, it is defined by the people who protect your trust.